perhaps one of the most key issues when it comes to kosher wine these days, and really for centuries, if not millennia, has been the issue of Gentiles and libations. That's something we're going to go back to the beginning in the Talmud in this episode of.
Welcome, everybody. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Professor Sacha Stern. Professor Stern, welcome. For those less familiar with him, he is Professor of Rabbinic Judaism at University College London, where he was head of Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies from 2012 to 2022. He holds a BA in Ancient History from Oxford, an MA in Social Anthropology from University College London, and a D.Phil in Jewish Studies from Oxford. He specializes in late antique and early medieval Jewish history, rabbinic literature, and the history of calendars, time reckoning, and astronomy. He has been principal investigator of several major research projects funded by the AHRC, the ERC, and several other foundations, and a research group organizer at the IIAS. He is the editor of the Journal of Jewish Studies and a fellow of the British Academy. And what leads us to the show is, speaking of JJS, an article you published a little over a decade ago.
Yes, quite a while ago, actually, yeah.
I guess it's how we reckon time, right? How do we, for some people, a decade ago is a blink of an eye, and for others, it's, 3 lifetimes ago.
It's how we manage our memory, isn't it?
Yeah, it's time. So you mentioned, what research have you carried out on time reckoning and calendars?
That's been my main research, actually, for the last 25 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
I've been working on time reckoning, time and particular calendars in the Jewish tradition, but also more generally, ancient calendars more generally.
Mm-hmm.
And it started off as a sort of sideline, but I quickly found out that it's actually a fascinating topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interdisciplinary. It brings together science, religion, liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really sort of multidisciplinary sort of area of investigation, which is actually quite important to our daily lives. No one can function without a calendar. It's really a fundamental structure of society.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, I sort of felt it was really high time that a proper look was given at calendars, not just sort of curious. So anyway, so that's what
do you mean so this is beyond Jewish studies? You're saying in general, I guess in late antiquity, other cultures, right?
Yeah. So I've done a lot of work on ancient calendars in general, and I wrote a book actually on calendars in antiquity. So that's from ancient Egyptian origins all the way to the end of antiquity. And of course, Jewish calendars have a place of pride in that story. But I've also written more specifically about the Jewish calendar all the way to the early modern period.
Oh, wow. Is that also a book or an article?
I've got some books. I've got articles.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. How did you, it's interesting because in my mind, you're known for the 1994 book on different identities in rabbinic literature. Obviously, for listeners of the show, this wine article. But so I guess my question is, how did you branch out more broadly beyond, Talmudic or Jewish late antiquity stuff material?
Right. So,
and also, I'm deeply fascinated that no broad general work on ancient or antiquity had been done around calendars.
I was trained as an ancient historian, so ancient history is really my discipline.
Okay.
But of course, I also learned in yeshiva, and I have a certain mastery of rabbinic literature. And I was actually employed here at UCL to teach courses of rabbinic Judaism. So my official title is Professor of Rabbinic Judaism, although that's not really my area of research.
Oh, wow.
And so as part of my historical inquiry, I was interested in calendars, and I'm interested in calendars in terms of history of science and also the social implications, of calendars, how societies run themselves. But alongside that, I have a long-standing interest in early rabbinic attitudes to paganism. And that involves, for example, attitudes to statues and images and idols. And I've written quite a bit about that. And also, I developed that interest in wine, the prohibition on non-Jewish wine. I guess that's how I come into this program, isn't it?
So it's sort of a subset of the rabbinic attitudes towards the other.
It is.
Okay, so that's how we got to. And did your I mean, we're going to be talking about Yain Nesach, libation wine, and Mishnah Tosefta Avodah Zarah, but did it ever touch upon any other aspects of wine, your research?
Not very much, no. But I have been an avid reader of Masechet Avodah Zarah. And of course, wine is something which keeps coming back there in different shapes and forms.
Yeah, well, it features prominently in the latter part of the fourth and really takes over the fifth chapter of Mishnah Avodah Zarah, but not exclusively. I think it's second, third chapter pops up here and there.
Yeah, there's quite a bit there about snakes depositing their poison venom in unattended wine.
Yes. All right. So, I guess really, like, how did you, so you went from that, it definitely takes over Mishnah Avodah Zarah. And I think what's for me really fascinating is the way it plays out in Tosefta Avodah Zarah. It really gets explicated some of the more articulated, some of the concerns a little bit more specifically. It expands it beyond just wine as well in the Tosefta.
The prohibition on non-Jewish wine is something which you find already in the book of Daniel. Okay, so Daniel and his companions will only drink water. They won't drink the wine that's being offered to them. No explanation is given there why there should be anything wrong with wine. You don't find anything earlier, in earlier biblical sources, no prohibition on Jewish wine. And the truth is that it's a long-standing tradition, really, in Judaism. You see it already in the book of Daniel, and it goes through the Second Temple period. It becomes very prominent in the Mishnah. So it's a very long-standing tradition. But the rationale behind it is never really well explained. And I was really surprised, when I was writing this article, I said, okay, when you write an article about the prohibition on Jewish wine, the first thing you need to do is to quote the relevant passage that tells you that non-Jewish wine is forbidden and for what reason. I couldn't find it. I just couldn't find it. I had a lot of trouble finding it. And I sort of meander at the beginning of this article, I sort of meander through different sources to try and show how implicitly, the explanation that is given is that non-Jews use their wine for libations. They offer their wine as a sort of small sacrifice offering to the gods, and that is what makes the wine forbidden. But it's never very clearly stated. You have to all the time read between the lines, and that was the first thing which really attracted my attention. Why is a prohibition on wine taken for granted rather than properly explained?
Can I just complicate it even further?
Yeah.
Which is that there's one thing against Gentile wine, and then separately against Yain Nesach. Is that a fair bifurcation? Or you think they're all really all part and parcel of the same package? I
don't actually see that distinction until you get to the later Talmudic layers.
Okay.
So when you get to the later Talmudic layers, you begin to see a very clear distinction between wine, which is known to have been used for a libation, and wine which you don't know. I mean, it comes from non-Jews, but you don't know what it was used for. And halachically, it makes a difference. Wine which is known to have been used for sacrifice is severely forbidden. Stam yayin, wine which we don't know, is forbidden, but the prohibition is more lenient, is less severe. But that's something which comes in a little bit later. Another later development, but that's a much later development, is to explain the prohibition on wine in terms of the danger that it could lead to intermarriage.
I mean, it's in the Gemara.
The interesting sort of idea that if you drink non-Jewish wine, you will drink wine with the non-Jews. And if you drink wine with the non-Jews, you're going to get mixed in with their good daughters or whatever, and get married to them. It's a really sort of, it doesn't sort of make a lot of sense to contemporary minds, but
right.
It's
also not far-fetched either.
Well, no, maybe not. But anyway,
it's just not, like you're saying, it's not such a direct connection.
It's not such a direct. So you see a bit of it in the Babylonian Talmud, maybe also in Yerushalmi, I can't remember now. Bavli, certainly you see it.
Yeah, I think the stomach.
Chaim Soloveitchik showed that it only really is taken as a serious explanation from the later 12th century onwards. But up to that point, nobody is really looking at non-Jewish wine as anything to do with intermarriage. It's all to do with this ancient prohibition related to idolatry.
That's really interesting. I don't want to carry us too far afield, speaking temporally, but I wonder if it maybe is by the medieval era, it's become decoupled from the association with libations, with idolatry. Certainly, wherever you look in Europe, amongst the Sephardim, no one's doing it aside from maybe within a limited sense within the Catholic Church in Europe. But
so let me explain then. So when you
I know we're getting far afield.
Yeah, it's okay. When you move into the medieval period, let's say when at the end of what we call the end of antiquity, the fall of the rise of Islam, let's say, the Islamic conquest. So after 100 or 200 years or so, the rabbis begin to realize that, hey, actually, the non-Jews nowadays are not quite the same as they used to be, because Muslims aren't allowed to drink wine, and they have nothing to do with wine. So why should their wine, if ever they come in contact with wine, why should this wine be a problem? That's in Muslim lands. In Christian lands, someone like Rashi in the Responsum writes that non-Jews nowadays don't do libations. They don't practice libations. Maybe we should talk a bit more in a minute about what a libation is. But they don't practice libations. So why should wine still be forbidden? The question is raised. So a line that I really like in Rashi, so he says in this responsum, he says, non-Jews nowadays are not suspected of making libations. They don't make libations of wine. They only drink it.
That's good.
But I think, so yeah, they only drink it. I think he's actually referring here to the Eucharist, actually. You know what I mean? In other words, the Christian ritual is not to offer the wine to the gods, although they still have wine in the church, but they drink it. That's the difference. A libation, so what's a libation? So let me explain. So a libation, you pour a bit of wine, it can just be a few drops, either on an altar or on the ground, and that is your offering to the gods. Okay, that's what the Greeks and the Romans and in the ancient world this was widely practiced. In the Middle Ages, no one does that, of course. They drink it.
Yeah.
So there is still a religious significance to wine among the Christians, not among the Muslims, but among the Christians. Wine can be a sanctified object. And I would be inclined to say that although there is a recognition in the Middle Ages that, yes, Christians don't do libations, there is still a lot of reluctance to allow non-Jewish wine because of the religious associations that Christians attach to it.
Yeah. So now that we're going, I'm going to bring it back because what is fascinating. What do we mean when we talk about libations? And so this actually makes me want to go back to your article because you just distinguish between the sort of the Greek, how they use libations, and then moving on to more of the Roman. I did find this fascinating in your article. You said wine libations were also performed during private meals. They were normally performed with a patera, and again, accompanied with prayers. The practice of libation remained common throughout the Roman Empire, and although presumably not identical in all places, it shared a body of traditions largely inherited from Greece and Rome. So they were doing it at various times, but there was a certain rituality associated with the libations, right?
Yeah, I think by and large, these practices are shared across the Mediterranean, and they are quite similar. And even as you move from early antiquity to late antiquity, the practices, I mean, we don't really know enough about it, that's the truth. Although
Really?
libations are very normal in ancient society, it's the sort of thing which is not described, the procedure of the libation is not described in great detail, but we have illustrations.
I wonder if they didn't really need to talk about it so much, aside from whatever, because probably everybody did it. They do it. What do you need to write it down for, since people were just engaged in it, right?
Yeah, it's a bit like calendars, Calendars also is something which,
oh, really?
Talking about calendars before, but calendars everyone takes for granted, and no one bothers to explain what they are.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode featuring Professor Stern. I'm going to break in and give you a sneak peek into the next episode featuring Professor Phil Lieberman.
So Natranai says that the alternatives to wine, which include date wine, honey wine, and so he mentions these specifically. He says they are unacceptable for reciting the songs of Passover.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into the next episode featuring Professor Lieberman. I want to give you a heads up. We're going to be taking a break, a few-week break now. So come back in mid-June and we'll have that episode ready for you. All right, now back into this episode featuring Professor Stern.
So here you see a libation scene. The individual here, a man, I think, is holding a fiale, which is a special vessel that is used for libations. It's especially dedicated for libations. Mm-hmm. And he's holding it above an altar. And what's going to happen is that he's going to be pouring the wine onto the altar. So this is from 480 BCE. So it gives you an idea of, how old the practice is. And of course, it's much older than that. And this is Attic, which means from the region of Athens. And then if you scroll down to the picture below that, can you move them? Can you move? Yeah, here we are. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So here's a woman with a jug and a soldier. The soldier is holding the fiale. The woman is pouring wine from the jug, which goes into the fiale, and then from the fiale, it pours down to the ground. And all this is actually depicted on the jar. Yeah, this is a wine jar. It's an illustration which is depicted on the wine jar, and a dog is looking on.
It's like instructions on the jar.
So this is very significant. You have here a soldier who is presumably about to go off to war. And before he goes off to war, he makes an offering, a libation to his gods. And this is a very typical context. So this is not an altar, as in the previous illustrations. So it's not part of a formal sacrificial ritual. This is a domestic, mundane act of worship, which is performed at a critical time. The soldier is going off to war. His wife, presumably it's his wife, doesn't know if he'll ever return. So this is a very critical moment. And they would offer libations when ships would depart from the harbor. Again, no one knows, will the ship return safe and sound? So this is a time to appease the gods by making an offering. What's interesting also to stress is that it's a very minimal and cheap offering. It's not like slaughtering an ox, which is very expensive. Oh. Yeah, it's a tiny bit of wine. It's just pouring a little bit of wine on the ground, and that's enough. So it's a kind of offering that anyone could do at any time. It's really cheap and easy. Here you have the sacrifice of an ox. You can see the ox.
Is it somewhere
in the
on
middle of the picture? This is a a Roman, this is from Pompeii, so this is Roman, and a libation is offered before the ox is slaughtered, a formal ceremony called the praefatio.
I really liked here you said, and this is more the Roman Empire, that they were never performed at random, but only in specific circumstances. They were closely associated with animal sacrifices, with wine drinking, dining, with warfare. Their performance conformed to a specific ritual involving the use of specific vessels, which you just mentioned, the shallow dish, such as the fiale or patera, from which the wine was poured on the altar and so forth. They went together with other rituals or acts of devotion, such as hand washing and prayer, which for me is fascinating. I mean, I guess the Roman style was more. It could have been.
No. Sorry to interrupt you. It's not just Roman. This is also Greek.
Oh, even Greek. Okay.
Yeah. This is really, you find this ubiquitously across the Greek and the Roman world. Yeah.
So they were a little bit more constricted in how they went about them rather than just doing wherever.
So that's one of the key arguments that I'm making in my article. Rabbinic literature has this assumption that non-Jews are capable of making libations at any time, in any circumstances, and sometimes almost invisibly. You can't see them doing it. Why is it that non-Jewish wine is forbidden? Why is it that if you leave your wine, Jewish wine, unattended in the presence of a non-Jew, you can't drink it afterwards? The reason is because a non-Jew could have made a libation without warning, completely randomly. And it's the randomness of the libation in the rabbinic mind which makes wine particularly problematic.
So I just have an idea, speculation. Is it possible that even though that these are what we have read about Greco-Roman libation practices, that might have been more, I don't know, I don't want to say statutory, but maybe more prescriptive? Maybe that's the way they're supposed to have been done in these very set rituals, set times, places. But maybe people are people. They went, they wanted to do their own thing. They felt so overjoyed by their Roman gods that they wanted to libate at a moment's notice, even wherever they happen to be. They spot some wine. I don't know that this is true or not. I'm just
it's a nice idea, but I mean people have taken on board the rabbinic assumption, and I've said, of course. I mean, of course, non-Jewish wine had to be forbidden in antiquity because that's what non-Jews did. They made libations every second. So people have sort of believed a little bit. But I'll tell you, if my sources were purely legal, then I would be inclined to agree with you that there is a distinction between the law and what people actually do.
Okay.
But what I'm talking about is a whole range of evidence, which you see either in iconographical representations, like the images we were looking at just now on these vases, or literary narratives, stories. In the vastness of Greek and Roman literature, you have all sorts of stories where a certain character makes a libation. When you put all these things together, you realize that libations are not random acts. They are acts which are performed for a reason.
Yeah.
Can
I quote you? Can I quote you?
Yeah, go on.
Or you say, although quick and easy and perhaps sometimes discreet, in real life, perhaps even more so than conveyed by literary, epigraphic, and iconographic sources, libations were not erratic, compulsive, or difficult to detect. They were performed in predictable circumstances in structured, explicit, and detectable ways, which is...
Exactly. Exactly. So you make a libation when you go to war, when your ship leaves harbor, when you make a truce, a treaty at the end of the war, you seal it with a libation. So much so that the Greek word for a treaty, spondai, means libations.
Oh, wow.
That's a word for a treaty.
Wow. By the way, The association with treaties and drinking actually goes back biblically. We have this in the book of Genesis. When Isaac makes a treaty with Avimelech, they have a mishteh.
Yes. Yes. True. Yes. True. True. But that's drinking. That's not offering the wine to the gods.
Fair, but wine's involved with a treaty.
But yes,
whether for one's consumption or for the gods. But
yeah, I'm sure you can find biblical references that wouldn't be too different. I'm sure you could. It's actually an important point to make, which is that in the temple there are also libations.
Yes.
So the act of pouring wine on the altar is also a Jewish Israelite form of worship. Important to make the point. And the similarity of this act with the pagan act of libation is something which could potentially be disturbing to the rabbis. Potentially, what's going on there,
Right. Well, I think a lot of what the rabbis proscribe with regards to Yain Nesach is specifically because it's a mirror image of rabbinic of Jewish libation practices.
It is, yeah. But then, of course, animal sacrifices also. So,
yes.
I mean, the Romans sacrificed pigs, which I don't think would be done in the temple. but oxen, for example, So there are similarities across the board. Coming back to libations, we have a text of Porphyry, which I quote at the end of the article. Porphyry is a late 3rd century Greek philosopher. He says that before we drink wine, we offer a little bit to the gods. This is again a very mundane act, but it's structured. You're doing it at a particular point in time and for a particular reason. Yeah, the god is pleased not by the size of sacrifices, but by ordinary things. And this is clear from the fact that when whatever is served as our daily food, everyone, before enjoying it, makes an offering of it. Yeah, so it's not just wine, but it could be bread also. And it's a small offering. It's a cheap offering. Everyone can afford to make it. And I'm reflecting further in the article that it's not so different from a Jew making a bracha before eating. It's a small act of devotion before eating.
Hey there, I wanted to break in. I hope you're enjoying the episodes so far. Actually, I hope you're enjoying all of the episodes, or at the very least, most of them. And if you haven't, and if this is your first episode, go check more of them out. But if you have been enjoying them, and if you enjoy the other resources that are shared at jewishdrinking.com, I hope you think about the opportunity of supporting the work that we do here and continue to do. Please feel free to visit jewishdrinking.com/donate, and you can help support the work and continue our mission and our vision of bringing l'chaims to life. Thank you so much, and now back into the show.
I'm fascinated by what you write. This was certainly a thought-provoking article for me. One of the things you mentioned, of course, in this, I guess we can call the discrepancy between the way that the Tanaim, the early rabbis, consider these things, and the way that the pagans, the Greco-Romans, actually behaved with this regard. You write, this is rabbinic law assumes that when a libation is made, not only the wine poured away as a libation and offered to the deity, but the entire contents of the jar or container from which this wine is poured or drawn become consecrated as yain nesach, libation wine. This assumption is the foundation of the rabbinic prohibition on non-Jewish wine, but it is difficult to relate to what we know of Greek and Roman practice and beliefs. Libations were not made from large containers, but only from small vessels. Even if the wine that remained in the fiale was considered in some way consecrated, the small amount of wine was meant to be drunk then and there from the fiale by the participants who thus shared the libation with the god. Okay, and so forth. I wonder, because I know you mentioned that for the Greeks and the Romans, they didn't consider what was the remnants, what was still remained in the containers to yet still be yain nesach or in any way consecrated to their gods, and yet the rabbis did. I wonder if maybe this is just a taboo, right? For the rabbis, they say, look, yes, what was poured out, that was actually yain nesach, but maybe what still yet could be poured out or so forth, even though it is not itself under suspicion of having been libated to the for idolatrous practices, but yet it's just become associated with it. They're using it even just the very act of having been transported or otherwise involved in the act of being poured out, even though it didn't actually make it out of the container, still retains I want to say shemitz, but it has a taboo aspect. It almost like as if we're sort of mapping on Tuma and Tara, so to speak, but in sort of for these libationary practices. Is that maybe a possibility?
Yes, taboo is definitely a word one can use,
Mm-hmm.
In the context of the prohibition on wine. Bit of a tricky word, taboo. I mean, taboo.
Yeah. Well,
you're sort of begging the question. You're describing it. Yeah, it is a taboo for sure. It's a taboo. Yeah, for sure. But why? What's Yeah, but this
mm-hmm.
question is asked by the medieval Talmudists.
Mm-hmm.
The Ritva.
Mm-hmm.
The Ritva asks the question. It's not a bad question at all to ask.
Mm-hmm.
That when a non-Jew makes a libation, the only bit of it, which is an offering to the gods, goes down, falls on the floor, and no one will pick it up and drink it. What remains in the bottle has not been offered. So why is it forbidden?
Mm.
He puts it as a halachic question,
mm-hmm.
and he doesn't really have a good answer. So this is a really interesting one because in a certain way, the whole prohibition on non-Jewish wine is based on the assumption that the remaining wine is forbidden. The wine that's been poured out has been poured out anyway, so it's not that you can drink it.
It's funny because it's interesting the way your mind's working around this, because maybe I'm being affected by the Rishonim and sort of the post-Talmudic rabbis, the way that they deal with this matter. I really have bifurcated that there's Stam Yinam, there's the Gentile non-libated wine, and then there's the Yain Nesach, the wine associated or otherwise used for libations. But I'm really fascinated. I'm not saying I'm arguing. I'm just like, I have to reorient my mind that maybe this is all one package. This is all Gentile wine. And at some point, somewhere along the way, they're going to libate. And even just having libations to idolatry, I think, is incredibly odious to Judaism in general and to the Tanaim in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it comes to the same thing, really, because if you're looking at actual wine that was offered to the gods, or you're looking at stam yain, so you don't know, a non-Jew was in contact with it, but at the end of the day, the concern you have with stam yain is that it might have been used in a libation ritual, but the same question would then arise there too, which is, even if it were involved in a libation ritual, why should the remaining wine be forbidden? And this is a really, it's an interesting question. And I think you're right. I mean, taboo is definitely a key word, here. But
so maybe not precisely taboo, but it feels uncomfortable.
There's a sort of bigger picture. There's a bigger picture here. Yeah, it's not just a technical prohibition on on idolatry, but there is definitely a bigger picture.
Right. And maybe that goes back to the lack of very specific articulation around all of this. It could be even, I'm thinking even more contemporaneously, very differently, but something that you already have mentioned in the course of this conversation, which is pig. So even, throughout the generations, that even Jews who do not keep kosher, but yet still many of them have just this utter resistance or discomfort with anything pork. I think that's what's going on here. They don't even need to articulate. The Tanaim and even the Amoraim don't really feel a need to explicitly articulate any association with it. They really want to keep these boundaries firm and far apart. And if it even, someone gets a whiff of thinking about Avodah Zarah, they stay far, far away. I think that maybe that's what's going on. They don't need to articulate because it's kind of emotional.
So this is really interesting. It's a sort of this. I've actually done a bit of work on that, not in this article, but elsewhere. But this experience of revulsion, towards the other, and it finds expression in many ways. But one of them is in context with the wine. I mean, you mentioned pork, which is another good example. But
it's
not just that something is forbidden.
Yeah.
Right?
I
Yes,
was going to say it's another forbidden consumable.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And it's not just that it's forbidden, okay, so I can't eat it, but there is, as you say, an emotional, I would say more than emotional, a bodily kind of, in Yiddish we say kishkas, I don't know how you say it in English, but your intestines sort of turn over at the thought of getting anywhere near a piece of pork. So this sort of feeling of inner bodily revulsion is illustrated, for example, in the second chapter of Avodah Zarah, where there is a lot of talk about snakes. I mentioned that earlier. Snakes depositing their venom in wine. And it's almost as if the snake touching the wine is a bit like the non-Jew touching the wine, and it's it's a conundrum of sort of,
sort of like a dangerous other.
The dangerous, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I'm still kind of struggling with the non-bifurcation of Stam Yinam and idolatrous. And by the way, it is funny because it also makes me think about that story where Shmuel, this is almost Tanaitic, early 3rd century, Shmuel sits down, he's drinking wine with his friend Avleit, and Avleit says, "Wait a second, I can't touch this wine." And he says, No, it's already muvoshal. It's fine. Like we can drink together.
Yeah, that's a nice story. Let me just make 2 remarks, okay? First of all, on this question of drinking with non-Jews, so there's a very interesting Tosafot in Avodah Zarah where he discusses whether you can drink a pint of beer with non-Jews. Because logically, if there's a prohibition on drinking wine because for socializing reasons, so beer should also be forbidden.
Yeah.
And he's clearly frowning on that, So in England, we go to the pub. I don't know what's the equivalent of the pub in the United States,
It's
but
not the same. It's
not the same thing, no.
No, you can go to a bar, but in England, it has a greater cultural pull.
There's a cultural tradition of the local pub, although the pubs are, particularly after COVID, a lot of pubs started closing down, and particularly where I live in London, they suffered a lot.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I know you might think that Jewish drinking only exists on podcasts, but guess what? It can be so much more. Have you ever wondered how to elevate an experience for your shul, JCC, other organizations, even businesses? I'm more than happy to chat to see how we can bring that to you. You can feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. We can see how I can help you bring L'chaims to life.
The other thing I would like to say that you keep coming back to this distinction between Yen Nesach, which is definitely used for libations, and Stam Yain. But and I told you that the distinction is something which only really develops in the late Talmudic layer. It is a relatively late distinction, but even still in the Middle Ages, it's extremely common for the Rishonim to use just the term Yen Nesach, when in fact they are referring to ordinary non-Jewish wine. So this confusion is maintained for a very long time, and I still hear this today. When I hear Orthodox people talking to each other, maybe in Yiddish it's more pronounced than in other languages, but Yen Nesach is a standard phrase for non-Jewish wine, even though everyone knows that there is no chance at all that it's been used for libation. But this confusion, I think, is a little bit, it's kind of deliberate and pejorative. It might be reinforcing a little bit this taboo that you were mentioning before. Towards the end of the article, this is wrapping up something we said before, but I suggest that this rabbinic idea that non-Jews can make libations at any time and any second is kind of a way of demonizing a little bit the non-Jew and sort of denying that idol worship is something which is structured and regulated, and on the contrary, it's random, it's dangerous. I'm sort of arguing that there is an attempt here to distinguish in a certain way Jewish religious practice from non-Jewish practice. And I've got a few other reflections on this.
So, Professor Stern, this has been fascinating, insightful, enlightening. I've definitely rearranged my approaches to wine, to Gentile wine in the rabbinic literature. Before we go, is there anything you would like to promote?
Nothing at all. Thank you very much for your interest in wine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, to that, I'm going to say l'chaim.
L'chaim to you.